This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What the hell is going on?
What's really going on?
We said, what the hell happened?
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
They see what's going on. I don't know what's going on. What is going on?
We must find out what is going on.
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? In which I do not remember my own name. Mark, what the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on is Israel is pummeling Iran, and it's a sight to see.
Yes.
I am just, we had a podcast months ago about the intricacies of the pager operation and the walkie-talkie operation, and I thought, wow, they built a company and they figured out a way to get Hezbollah to buy these pagers at discount prices. And just what an intricate operation that was. And then we learned that the Mossad built a drone factory inside Iran, not just inside Iran, in downtown Tehran, to build drones to attack Iran, the Iranian regime from inside. I mean, just the level of sophistication of this operation, the planning that took, I think they said that those drones, there were drones brought in on trucks, they were brought in 17, 18 years ago. They have pre-positioned material for this attack during the Bush administration in 2006, 2007. And it is just stunning what the Israelis have accomplished in a few days and what they're doing. From a strategic level, from a tactical level, absolutely flabbergasted and amazed at Israel is like the leading edge of defending the West from this horrible, horrible threat of Islamic radicalism.
Right. And, look, you guys are going to hear in our just fantastic conversation with Haviv, Rettig, who we've had on before, that the Israelis understood what the job was, right? The Israelis understood that this was not Afghanistan. This is not Iraq. This is a go in, do the job, get out. And it's not a one-day operation. It's not even a 3-day operation. It's potentially, as the Israelis have said, an up to 2-week operation.
Or more.
But I hope not too much more, but I will say that they are just hugely impressive. For this generation watching now, you all were not around to watch the Israelis annihilate their Arab neighbors in the Six-Day War, and then 6 years later to annihilate them again in the Yom Kippur War. And so, you've seen a series of more ambiguous, more difficult, more challenging wars in both Lebanon and then in Gaza. This is what the Israelis can do. This isn't house-to-house fighting. This is a beautiful marriage of technological supremacy, intelligence, smarts, a recognition that intel needs to be better after October 7th, and just terrific, terrific planning. It may not all work if they don't get Fordow, but the Iranians, other than trying to kill a bunch of civilians in Israel, which they are trying to do, the Iranians have no recourse. Mark and I just watched the anchor woman on Iranian television.
Run for her life.
Run for her life. So it is incredible. And let me also, in this weird podcast in which I say something good about Donald Trump, I'm going to also say something good about Elon Musk, who has activated free Starlink for all of Iran. Good for you, Elon Musk.
Yeah. The one thing you left out of your list is testicular fortitude of Bibi Netanyahu's leadership. I think somebody had a meme on X that you could actually see Bibi Netanyahu's cojones from a satellite in space. That's how much guts this thing took. So the Iranians have, something like 2,000 ballistic missiles, something like that. Their plan for an attack on Israel was a barrage of 1,000 missiles, right? And so Israel launches this attack, and they manage to gather the entire leadership of the Iranian air forces with a phone call to a prepositioned place that they had already set up so they could take them all out, which meant that there was nobody to give the order to carry out the ballistic missile attack, then took out a lot of the launchers and a lot of ballistic missiles. In the end, they were only able to launch a few hundred ballistic missiles in their initial assault, which saved countless lives in Israel because 1,000 ballistic missiles could really overwhelm Israel's defenses. A few hundred was able to overwhelm it a little bit and get through, but they really haven't gotten through as much as they would have hoped. And now they're taking out their ballistic missile launchers, their ballistic missile. Every time they launch one, Israel knows where it came from and they can take out that capability. You're going to get to the point where they're only going to be able to launch, 20, 30 missiles at a time. That can be shot down by the Iron Dome. bomb. So they've given their best, I think, at this point in terms of retaliation, and it hasn't been that good. And Israel is now flying, they were flying F-35s, which have all this stealth capability. They're now flying old F-15s and F-16s over Iranian airspace, because they completely own the skies over Iran and can strike at will without fear of being shot down. It is just a stunning, stunning achievement.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely. Listen, this is incredible.
So before we go to our guest, I want to talk a little bit about the end game here because, right now, I think the IAEA put out a report saying that they have not seen any radiological leakage from Fordow or from Natanz yet. So it doesn't seem like they've hit the centrifuges.
A little bit at Natanz.
Yeah. So far, they have not taken out the nuclear program per se, though they've damaged it and they've set it back. Can this end without Fordow being taken out? And can that be done without the U.S. doing it?
So let me talk quickly about Fordow for our listeners. Iran has a very, very dispersed nuclear weapons program, and a lot of their research is done in universities, in small centers. Even the smaller level testing was done at a site called Parchin. Its first nuclear cascade was at Natanz, which Mark was talking about. IAEA's Director General Rafael Grossi has basically said that he thinks that Natanz is gone. The Israelis took the electrical power out first at Natanz and then hit it when the centrifuges stopped working. Fordow is Iran's response to exactly what's happening right now. In other words, Fordow is a response to the possibility of a major strike.
Built inside of a mountain.
Right. So just so people understand, a nuclear weapons program is not something that Mark and I could build in our basements. So what it requires in the way that Iran is now enriching uranium is what's called a cascade. That means advanced centrifuges. Advanced centrifuges are very sensitive. Advanced centrifuges that work in a cascade to enrich. That takes a lot of real estate. So what they needed to do to have this massive real estate is they needed to burrow into this mountain in order to protect it. So there are small entrances, railheads, and things like that. But then otherwise, everything is underground. The only weird thing about it is in an earthquake zone. So that is a risk for the centrifuges. But this, in the Iranian mind, protected it. And this is why the Israelis have been asking for and why we know that they have requested from Donald Trump to get this 11,000-ton bomb, right? The massive ordnance.
Moab.
Yeah.
Mother of all bombs, as they called it.
It.
The largest non-nuclear bomb in existence.
Exactly. And that apparently needs to be dropped from a C-130. So that is the question. And I think the Israelis are unbelievably ingenious. There are people still insisting that the Israelis can take out Fordow on their own. But the bottom line is that if we want to take this out, if we want to get rid of this. Oh, and I should make another little asterisk note for our listeners. This site at Fordow was not discovered by the U.S. intelligence community. It was revealed to us by an Iranian opposition organization that may or may not have gotten that information from the Israelis. But the CIA completely missed it. So we still don't know. But I think that in order for the end to be decisive, that would need to happen.
And the other way to get it is with B-2 bombers assembled at Diego Garcia, which could take it out in short order if we deployed those. Do you see a scenario where we could do sort of a lend-lease thing, where we let the Israelis fly the B-2s and say, here you go, put an Israeli pilot in a B-2 and let them take it out?
I think that's very unlikely. I see it much more likely that they transfer a Moab to the Israelis and let them do it. But listen, Mark, we saw that huge fleet of tankers heading for Europe, redeploying out of the United States into a different theater, and the administration is explaining to reporters that that is to give the president options if he chooses to use them. I suspect that Donald Trump is thinking very hard about this right now. I hope we see maybe before our podcast is out.
All right, well, let's go to our interview then.
So Haviv Rettig, who everybody's heard from before, is a veteran Israeli journalist. He's a senior analyst for the Times of Israel. He's covered Israel's politics, foreign policy, and the relationship with the Jewish diaspora for 2 decades. He also was the director of communications for the Jewish Agency for Israel, which is the country's largest NGO. He's just a terrific analyst.
Here's our interview. Well, Haviv, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Mark and Danielle. It's great to be here.
Well, we want to get into what precipitated this operation and how it's unfolding and what's next. But before we even ask you that, I mean, you're in Israel, I believe, in Jerusalem, right?
Yeah.
Tell us what your life has been like being on the ground while this war is taking place.
It's been a strange few years with COVID, and then for Israelis, October 7 and mass call-ups and this very complex sort of new reality in the Middle East and in the country. It feels as though it's one of those moments where everything is suspended, but there have been so many moments where everything is suspended that it's almost routine that life is suspended. The kids have no school because even though all the schools have bomb shelters everywhere, you don't assume that you can herd 500 kids into the right rooms, specifically in a school with the minute and a half notice that our current radar systems give us when the sirens go off. So schools have been closed. The school year will end in a week or two, but the kids are not going to go back by then. So everyone's tried to move to Zoom, and it's working as well as it worked everywhere else in the world during COVID. And our apartment, because it was built after 1991, was the year that all apartments were required because of the first Gulf War, from that moment on, to be built with a room that is up to spec for a bomb shelter. So we have one of those rooms in our apartment, and it was my office because it's not so comfortable. The window is thick. You don't get a lot of breeze. So it's my office rather than anybody's bedroom. But now it's, of course, where all 4 kids sleep every night. And my wife and I come in at night when the siren goes off. The siren has gone off like clockwork every night at 4 a.m. roughly. And then everyone else manages to return to sleep, but I don't. So I'm extremely sleepless, sleep deprived, and emotionally off kilter. And so it's been fun. But I should say there are 27, I believe now, dead Israelis. There are at least a couple hundred wounded. There are, according to the Iranians, they launched some 1.5 ton missiles traveling, faster than the speed of sound, smashing into apartment buildings. The difference between being in the bomb shelter room and not being in the bomb shelter has now been demonstrated. We have footage that my kids every morning wake up knowing of the siren, having woken up for the siren, experiencing the siren. And last night they didn't wake up when the siren went. My wife and I walked in, we all just stayed there, and the kids slept right through it all, which somehow is more sad. They woke up in the morning and then all of their buddies are all sharing, my oldest is 14, so he already has a cell phone. They're all sharing video footage from whatever destruction there was overnight. Last night there were 8 people killed and dozens wounded, and these images of people walking with their phone cameras, right, through their own apartments after they were destroyed. The family had all been in the bomb shelter room, and they start in the bomb shelter room. Everything's in place. There's the kids, stuffed animals and whatever. And then they walk out of the bomb shelter room and everything is just destroyed. There's just a decimated, walls caved in, ceiling caved in. And so these are good videos being shared by Israeli society because they're telling people, don't futz around, go into the bomb shelter. But nevertheless, my kids are now living with the consciousness that they're under this barrage from a very far away nation whose beef with us they have no comprehension of and don't know why anyone would want to launch missiles at us like this.
Look, it's unbelievable, and it's very clear that Iran is bombing indiscriminately. Israel's made that very clear in its social media and elsewhere, and it's absolutely true. Mark and I were just talking about the strike on Iranian state broadcasting, and of course, Israel put out in Farsi and Arabic before the bombing that there was bombing coming in Tehran and Sector 3, and that everybody should evacuate or go to a safe place. That's not what the Iranians are doing. So,
But Danny, I've been very heartened by all the marches around the world criticizing the Iranian regime for indiscriminate killing of civilians.
Yes, I feel really good about that too. And the UN, of course, which is out there really protesting what the Iranians are doing. So, Haviv, let's talk politics for a sec. For the last, 35, 38 years, I have grown to the view and have repeated often that the only way to deal with the Iranian nuclear weapons program is militarily. Bibi has been prime minister 5 times?
I don't know, really twice or 3 times, because there were only 2 other periods in which he wasn't in between. So he won in 96, he won in 2009, and then consistently right up until the Bennett-Lapid government, which was the last government. So 3 periods of probably 18 years or so, something like that.
Right. Bibi has been warning the world about how Iran is advancing, how they've advanced beyond red lines and his zone of immunity Iran entered long ago. What triggered the decision to go finally?
According to the Israelis, according to the IDF and Netanyahu himself, the Iranians were escalating massively in an effort to be able to produce ballistic missiles that were much more advanced than what they have now, much more numerous than what they have now, an arsenal of a few thousand missiles that could reach Israel. I've seen estimates of 1,200. I've seen estimates of 3,000. I don't know the number. These are analysts coming in from different places. But they were going to be able to produce between 3,000 and 10,000 a year by the time they had escalated this thing. And so they would have have a missile arsenal that could destroy Israel without talking about nukes. And that missile arsenal had to be taken out because unlike, for example, Turkey, which has squadrons of F-35s and various other countries that have tremendous military capabilities, they don't intend to use it against us and launch random wars, then massive destruction and wipe us out. And the Iranian regime keeps saying it does, and it keeps doing everything possible to convince us that it does, from handing 200,000 rockets and missiles to Hezbollah and funding them, etc., to all the rest of these proxy system and all the rest of the things that the Iranians have done to the Israelis, including launching hundreds and hundreds of ballistic missiles before this past weekend, just in the last 20 months. The conventional missile program was going to become something that could not be reined in, and so had to be dismantled now. And of course, most famously, the nuclear program. Last week, the IAEA put out this unbelievable report that it was over. I mean, inspectors couldn't go in. They were breaking out. They were capable. They were going to, the world is basically waiting on Khamenei's desire to find out whether or not he's going to go for a nuke. And that's not okay for the Israelis. That's not enough.
So I wanted to follow up because I think none of us are nuclear weapons experts on this discussion, but it's important for people to understand that Iran had accumulated enough for probably about 10 nuclear weapons of 60% highly enriched uranium, which is very easy to take from 60 to 90%, which is the requirement. Really, all the work is up front. They were also apparently, and I think the U.S. agrees with this, and the IAEA probably as well, they were also moving forward on modeling a test detonation and investing in detonators that suggest that they had somehow made a go, no-go decision, right? Because we've been hovering for the last few decades on the question of whether they go the North Korea route or they go the Japan route, right? And it seems like they had made a North Korea decision. Is that what you hear too?
Yeah, I think it's important. Some of that Netanyahu has just said publicly, so that is the Israeli thinking. But I'll just say the problem with Iran, we're seeing a lot of sort of pro-Iran accounts on social media argue that Israel wants a weak Iran, and this is just Israel being an imperialist power in the region and things like that. And it's an interesting way to frame it because it allows you to really explain that, in fact, the problem with Iran is that it is desperately weak. The problem with Iran is that it built out this proxy system as a way to both bleed Israel dry, destroy Israel as part of its religious revolutionary kind of ideology, and it wants to show that the Shia can destroy Israel after a century of Sunnis failing to destroy Israel within that internal Islamic competition. There's a whole lot of reasoning, and it's fascinating, but it's not the point. The point is, Iran has really come for the Israelis, and on October 7, the Israelis became convinced that we don't understand our enemies anymore. We thought we understood. We thought we had calculated their deterrence and their exact frame of mind, but it turned out we were utterly and catastrophically mistaken. And we looked from that lesson we learned with Hamas, where we were convinced for 15 years that Hamas was deterred and contained, and we discovered actually we'd been wrong every minute of those 17 years or whatever it was. We then looked at Hezbollah and we said, well, what if we don't understand them either? And we looked at in Tehran and we said, what if we don't understand them? And so Hezbollah's arsenal of 200,000 rockets, buried under 300 Lebanese villages in South Lebanon, suddenly looked very dangerous, because what if they're there to be used? What if Iran's expenditure of billions at the cost of not supplying healthcare to its citizens was actually meant to actually achieve a specific goal one day, and that arsenal wasn't there not to be used? And so we discovered that we had to dismantle the proxy system. We had to dismantle the Iranian nuclear program. Everything was over. The Israelis discovered that because they don't understand the enemy, it's a new kind of intellectual humility that drove us to basically what's happening over the skies of Tehran at this moment. That's Israel when it takes Occam's razor. If the Iranians spent 46 years telling us we're a cancerous tumor that they will remove in a great triumphant religious war, then we're going to believe them. And if somebody wants to be super clever, sitting in a think tank or university out there in the West, explaining to us, no, they didn't actually mean it, you don't have to overreact. Hundreds of ballistic missiles later and building of massive proxies that have attacked us on all fronts for generations, at some point we're going to believe them. And the great tragedy for the Iranians is that we believe them. And so we began the dismantling of those proxies in a systematic way over the last 20 months. And what resulted was an astonishing thing, not astonishing for me. I'm going to toot my own horn here. I argue that they've been weak. I've been arguing that for many, many years. I've been arguing that if you look at Iran and you look at the regime and you realize the astonishing, unbelievable resources that this nation has, the oil and the human resources, the educated middle class, and what the regime has been able to do or failed to do with that human resources and those extraction resources, you realize it's actually an incompetent, stupid regime that all it's been able to do in 46 years, it's one success. And it is actually a good accomplishment, but nevertheless, its only accomplishment is its own survival through the oppression of its own people. And I have argued that this regime looks big, looks dramatic. Tucker Carlson explained that this would be the start of World War III because he's obviously a great geopolitical analyst who checked the data. And all these different people all over the world for years and years, the Obama administration said things like this. And, like idiots like me, warmongers, I mean, I'm tooting my own horn here. I've made many mistakes. I'm not going to tell you about any of those. But this one I got right. Warmongers like me have been saying, what if they're weak? What if they're weak and we have no choice? And it turned out over the last 20 months that they're weak. And now that they convinced us that we have no choice, which is a very stupid thing to do to an enemy, we've come for them. Here's the problem. And this is the last sentence. I'm sorry for the whole rant. They convinced us we're weak, and so we set about through great cost, and also through the demonstration of extraordinary abilities and capabilities, dismantled their proxy system and demonstrated how weak they are. Back in November, 120 Israeli planes flew circles over Iranian airspace and took out factories, missile factories in Iran, and showed the regime that their missile defenses, luckily for us, they invested in Russian air defenses, and so we could do anything we wanted in Iranian airspace, and that revealed to everyone, to the entire Middle East, how weak this regime actually is. And that made this regime desperately dangerous. And this is the point. Because everyone knows they're weak now, they actually need that bomb. Thinking about the bomb, talking about a bomb, looking at a bomb, but everyone's terrified of them. The whole world dances to their fiddle because of that kind of way of talking and policy and strategy. But now that nobody's dancing to their fiddle because everyone understands what they have been revealed to be by the Israelis' willingness to actually challenge them on their own terms, now they actually need the protection of that nuclear umbrella. And so everything got much more dangerous. And that nuclear program actually has to be taken out urgently.
There's so many things you just said that I want to drill into. You pointed out about taking the words of the enemy seriously. I think the lesson of history for over a century now has been the failure to take the enemy's words seriously is the greatest strategic mistake everyone made. Lenin told us, he wrote What is to be done and told us about his plans to overthrow the Tsar and build a communist totalitarian empire. Hitler wrote Mein Kampf and told us what he planned to do with the Jews. Osama bin Laden issued his fatwa declaring war in America, and we didn't take him seriously. Putin, wrote a 2,000-word essay explaining why Ukraine was a part of Russia and had to be reabsorbed. And the Iranians have told us that they plan to destroy Israel. In every previous case where a dictator has told us his plans, they followed through. And Israel seems to be the first nation in the last century to actually take the words of the enemy seriously and act on them.
In everyone else's defense, only after the enemy went to extraordinary measures to convince us. We had a whole strategic theory that said they were all deterred because look at our capabilities. Obviously, they knew our capabilities. Turns out they're not competent enough to study us, believe in divine grace that will rescue them from any capabilities we might have, and absolutely seriously wanted to destroy us. And so we were wrong about everything. And so it's an intellectual humility in us born out of failure. And that's generally how this works. When you're humbled by the enemy, you fight better. It's a much more humble Israel that is fighting today in Iran, and it's the cause and reason for its successes.
And to your point about their weakness, how significant was the feckless retaliation against the last Israeli strikes on Iran? Because Israel has lived in fear of this missile barrage for decades. And the fact that they were so unable to penetrate Israel's defenses so effectively, those ballistic missile attacks were deterred. Was that key in the decision to go ahead and do this, that the Israeli society suddenly woke up and realized they really are not as dangerous right now as we thought they were?
So first of all, yes, but I would say that a lot of things happened. First of all, I don't know the detail. There's a lot of fog of war. The Israelis are doing some extraordinary things. I don't understand them entirely. The thing that demonstrated the regime's haplessness and fecklessness and incompetence was the aerial superiority that Israel achieved with, F-15s that have, I think, an 800-kilometer flight distance, flying 2,400 kilometers to bomb Mashhad in eastern Iran, and just the capacity to extend our distances. We have planes launching ballistic missiles. Planes should not be launching ballistic missiles. Ballistic missiles are missiles that go very high up so that they can go very far as they go down, right? It's the ballistic arc. Planes launch direct point-to-point missiles that go straight with fuel, but you can only carry so much fuel in a missile you put on a plane. So how does a plane launch a ballistic missile? Well, you could program it to launch out of the plane and then go up, and then essentially glide vast distances, but it's very hard to guide a plane that glides a vast distance, except if you're Israeli and have been working on the problem for a decade. And then you develop ways to create these missiles that can glide collide to their targets over vast distances. And so Israeli F-15s flying within the range of an F-15 can shoot a ballistic missile over Iran that doubles the range of those. That's new. That's new. Putting missiles under the wings of F-35s, that's not something that the designers of the F-35s over in America ever designed those wings to do. And so there are all these capabilities. But as the Israelis began really seriously examining Iranian capabilities, they discovered some extraordinary things. For example, they have this huge arsenal of ballistic missiles that can reach Israel, but they don't have a huge number of launchers. And so they're limited. The launchers are the bottleneck. And so the Israeli Air Force and the Mossad with these drone factories, the main target, for example, last night, the Israeli Air Force essentially just spent the night hunting launchers. Any launcher that it could identify, because it launched something, the Air Force focused in on it and sent a strike at it. And the idea is as you shrink the number of launchers, at the beginning you had, I think it was 100 missiles fired the first night, and then it was 80, and then it was 50, and then it was 30, and last night they went up, forgive me if the numbers are incorrect, but the basic story is correct. They went back up to 50, but the denial of launchers has been the bottleneck that has prevented Iran from having the kind of strategic response that they wanted to have. And so, aerial superiority, taking out the radars, taking out the air defense systems of Iran unbelievably quickly and easily back in November, and then now focusing in on the correct thing. We're going to eventually get to the entire missiles arsenal. This is not going to last another 2 days. This is going to go on for a while. But in the meantime, we're going to deny them the capability of actually using that missile arsenal through these launchers. Now, what the heck kind of army, knowing that it's going to basically depend, if the proxy thing doesn't work, on its own ballistic missiles, because it doesn't have an Air Force to speak of. The Air Force is still flying Vietnam-era F-4 Phantoms, the Iranian Air Force. I mean, it's really kind of incompetent and pathetic for one of the countries that should be one of the wealthiest countries in the world just from the extraction economy. But it's spent so many years being ideologically committed to nukes and the destruction of America that it failed to be anything that it could have been. What the heck kind of incompetent army like that builds out an arsenal of missiles but doesn't have secure, safe, deeply buried underground launchers to actually be able to use them? So Iran really is a sad sack in terms of military capability. Now, it's always dangerous to say that. The enemy always surprises, and you only strut around with pride after you've won. But it is astonishing how bad they've been so far. And maybe they're going to regroup, and maybe their intelligence services are going to give them some big, great target, and they're going to succeed in some big way. I certainly hope not, but maybe. But so far, this is the story of a regime that has lived too long on the belief that Arabs somewhere out there in the proxy system in Iraq and Lebanon and Yemen are going to die for them, and they'll never have to actually face the Israelis. That's what this looks like.
I agree with you entirely, Haviv. I think your analysis is spot on, and I will say that our guys in the Critical Threats Project and on the rest of our team at AEI have been saying the same thing for many years. The U.S. intelligence community, the Barack Obamas of this world, the Joe Bidens of this world, and all of their fellow travelers in Washington have always argued that the Iranians are a potent force, World War III, blah, blah, blah. We can't take them out in Syria because this, we can't take out Hezbollah because that, we can't do this. And the reality is exactly what you suggest, which is that Iran is a defensive power. It is incompetently managed, and not even competently managed towards their aims. And that is the critical thing. It's not just that they can't run an economy. They can't run much. And if you look at what they've achieved, yes, they've achieved an awful lot. Imagine what they could have achieved if they were doing something good for their own people with that money. I want to ask you the hard stuff now, which is, where do we go from here? We are talking to you on Monday, and I'm guessing, Mark, that we may want to put this out sooner given the rapidly changing situation. But what we see is that Iran is desperately working the phone lines, trying to get its friends from the Obama era, its friends in the think tank community, its friends in Oman, its friends in Qatar, its friends in the Trump administration, its friends in the MAGA world. All of them are being operationalized now to get the United States to get the United
Mark,
States.
you're getting a colder.
I know, I'm sorry. I just sneezed there.
To get talks back on and get the Israelis to stop the attack. The G7 is meeting right now. The G7 wanted to put out a statement calling for de-escalation between Iran and Israel. Mark, breaking news for you. Donald Trump refused to sign it. What do you think? Will Israel be talked out of finishing the job?
There's a specific goal. My people have been massacred and bled. Lebanon has been internally demolished and weakened by an Iranian proxy that just didn't care what would happen to Lebanon, and in fact planned for an Israel-Lebanon war that would destroy Lebanon as badly as Gaza's situation. And Assad murdered 600,000 people only after Iran gave him the backing and the survival ability to do so. And, America went into Iraq. You can love it or hate it. You can critique the war. There were a lot of problems with that war, both with the justification and with the management of the war, the dismantling of the Iraqi army on day one, for example. But the American point and purpose was to build a much better Iraq. The Pentagon built vast numbers of schools in Iraq. And all Iran did that entire time was activate Shia militias to try and prevent Iraq from ever being the kind of country that it could be. This is a regime that, if it survives this relatively unscathed, and forgive me, the death of, 20 generals is unscathed. I don't care about their existence and their lives, and I don't think Khomeini cares about their existence and their lives. If this is a regime that is set back by a year in terms of its missile building capacity, and that's it, and we've reached this moment after all the sacrifices, what we did to Hezbollah, that was a one-time thing, right? Nobody is now going to ever again trust a random foreign beeper supply chain that reaches out to you with great prices. These are intelligence. I don't know if the Mossad has the ability going forward to again build drone factories on Iranian soil for deployment at the moment of the launch of the war, to take out those launchers. So no, we have to make this count, and make this count means safety. De-escalation is not a goal. De-escalation is a means. The goal is security and safety. And if you can't explain to us how de-escalation will give us security and safety, none of it matters. Now here's how Iran could get out of it. And this is something that I think the Trump administration has said publicly. And if it hasn't said it publicly, I know for a fact it's been saying it privately. The great debate over infrastructure. In other words, the negotiation over the nuclear program is a negotiation not over asking Iran politely not to go to nukes and agreeing to IAEA supervision right up until they decide they don't want IAEA supervision. That's essentially the Obama strategy. And that's the kind of strategy that Clinton employed with the North Koreans that resulted in a North Korean nuke, right? So what we need is the removal of infrastructure, of the ability to enrich, the dismantling and destruction of Fordo, the blowing up of those halls full of centrifuges. We need the removal of the infrastructure. Iran can be brilliant, beautiful, happy-go-lucky country. If Iran reaches the level of Turkey, everybody in Iran will be happier, and they'll have F-35s and be best friends with America. Iran can be a great nation, but it cannot be a great nation building nukes trying to destroy me. So that capacity to build those nukes has to be removed, because this is a regime that we believe will use those nukes. If that's the new negotiation, Iran has an exit ramp off of this path. But the negotiation has to no longer be about whether Iran has 15 more years of delaying and questioning and thinking and feeling its feelings. You dismantle the nuclear infrastructure in its totality, everything gets blown up, or we have to find other ways of getting it all blown up. And that's it. That's the story.
So I agree with you. I agree that that's the right way to frame this. I don't know where Donald Trump is going to go, and I don't know what he's going to do. We've seen the massive fleet of tankers heading toward the region. We've got an aircraft carrier heading back west after being destined for the Pacific region. All indicators are Donald Trump gets this, wants to be part of this, wants to help, wants to accelerate the process so that we can get to the talks we need to get to after the infrastructure is destroyed. But if you and Mark and I had been sitting down a week ago, 5 days ago, we would have all been wringing our hands, because Steve Witkoff, Donald Trump's close personal friend and the negotiator for everything under the sun, appeared to be more Rob Malley than he did Donald Trump. What I worry about, and how much should I worry about this, and maybe I should be answering this question since I'm the one in America. Yeah. Seriously speaking, the Israelis have to be taking this into account. If this is the quality of the advice that the president is getting from the likes of Witkoff, shouldn't Israel be more worried?
So, first of all, I can try to give an Israeli perspective, but
I just gave the American, I just gave my perspective.
Everything you said here, both of you know more than I do about. But on the question of what Israelis are seeing, as far as we can tell, Bibi went in to meet with Trump back in the spring. I think it was in March when he was in the White House for the first time. I forget exactly. And he came out of there, and there was some briefing to Israeli reporters that I don't know how much to trust it. I don't know exactly what it means. But the basic idea of the briefing was the statement that Trump asked Bibi for a home run. In other words, what Trump doesn't want, and when he says we're not going to more wars, what he means is grinding Middle Eastern wars without clear results that cost us vast amounts of money and some blood even, and then everybody leaves Afghanistan after 18 years and everything's just basically where it was when we went in. That's not something Trump is willing to do. So what he told Bibi, he challenged Bibi. Now, I know that top Israeli reporters were saying this was what they were hearing at the time when Bibi was in Washington, and might have been hearing it from the Israelis as far as I can tell, that Trump said, just give me a home run and I can back it. And what we've seen so far is basically that. Bibi went home and he said, hi Mossad, you've been building 15 of these home runs over there are things that are happening in Iran that people haven't even, because so many huge things happen, people have stopped noticing some of them. Simultaneous car bombs taking out not nuclear scientists, but specifically weaponization scientists, where that was, as you said, Danielle, that was exactly the thing that was on the verge. The granular level of the intelligence, the ability to be so involved in the scheduling of the IRGC Air Force chiefs to the point where they could ensure that the start of the war coincides with a meeting so that they could take out, I forget what it was, like 8 of the top 14 people in the IRGC Air Force, including the number 1 guy, all in one meeting with one missile. That's that level of granular intelligence penetration. The Mossad prepared, and the IDF emphatically, and the coordination between the two, which has been truly unbelievable and astonishing, prepared this home run. And they prepared it in a way that's entire design appears to have been built to answer Trump's one demand. Trump is willing to fight for Israel. He's not willing to have a Middle Eastern war for Israel. And that's the difference. And so all these Tucker Carlsons screaming and raging and raving, and Candace Owens saying, well, all the white men are going to die for the Israelis, and it's not anti-Semitic to say so. So other than them being raving lunatics, which, everybody has the right to be a raving lunatic, I don't want to take that away from them if it makes them happy. But the actual policy conversation between the United States and the Trump administration, between the Israelis and the Trump administration and the United States, appears to very much have taken those sentiments of the Trump administration to heart. And the Israelis, I don't think in the history of warfare anyone has more aligned with that sentiment. Make it fast, make it count, make it powerful. We can deliver the knockout blow on Fordo as much as the Israelis have. And then the great question is, will America deliver that knockout blow on Fordo?
Well, that's the question. So can Israel do this alone? Does this require the U.S. to come in and deliver the coup de grace, or can Israel do this without U.S. intervention?
That's one of those questions that I simply don't know the answer to, and it's a yes or no question. Does the Mossad have the ability to pull something out of its sleeve? The kind of supply chain explosive operation we saw with Hezbollah has already been done before by the Mossad. There was an operation, I forget the year, in which the Mossad basically managed to penetrate the supply chain of the furniture provider of one of the Iranian nuclear sites, and a big desk exploded in one of these underground facilities. Has the Mossad been able to, at a mass level, penetrate in various unpredictable ways that I can't imagine those kinds of institutions? Smart people, the people who delivered for us all the astonishing, miraculous achievements of the Mossad in the last 20 months, have been thinking about nothing else. In other words, everybody understood that Israeli F-15s and F-16s and F-35s, from wherever they're shooting and however they're refueling, would have the ability, it's gone better than they expected, I think, but everybody understood that they would be capable of taking out the very shallow stuff at Natanz and of the facilities that are above ground. And the big question was always going to be Fordo. And the kind of planning we've seen so far tells me that there's no way on earth that big question has not been addressed by those same brains that gave us all the other achievements of the last 20 months. I can't believe the Israelis have no options. However, it is also possible that there are no other options, that this one place, the most important place, the reason they built it the way they built it deep under a mountain, is because these are the enrichment halls, these are the advanced centrifuges. That's the one place that we haven't penetrated with our intelligence. We have to assume competence on the part of the Iranians at some point, right? At some point we must encounter some competence. And so it's possible this is the last step that we can't do alone. I simply don't know, but those are the kinds of questions that we're all looking to answer, kind of, desperately.
If we don't take out Fordo, will this have backfired? Will the answer be that the Iranians will have basically survived it with their nuclear program intact in some way, and that they will actually be quicker to develop a nuclear weapon as a result?
Look, the simple answer is that all the things everyone is saying are all true all at once. If we stop now, then yes, Iran has not suffered the kind of military capability setback that gives us real time and a real achievement. And it will only have been costs, and everything that's built up to now, including the crushing of Hezbollah and all the sacrifices made by so many Israeli soldiers and agents on the road to all of this, will have been wasted. But it's not going to stop now. It's going to achieve some great significant part of its goals. There is almost no way to completely remove the Iranian nuclear program totally. There is an indigenous knowledge base that isn't going anywhere. They know how to do it, and so they can do it again. I'll say even more than that. Let's imagine a best case scenario where a humiliated and crushed and pathetically begging clerical elite, this revolution falls, and other power bases in Iranian society step in, whether it's from the economic power bases, the army that isn't the Revolutionary Guard says, you guys have screwed up, we're taking over. These are the kinds of things you saw in the fall of the Soviet Union, where there were these other power bases that stepped to the fore because the whole thing was collapsing. And then the question becomes, that new regime will look around and it'll see that India has a nuke and Pakistan has a nuke and the Israelis have a nuke. And what if it says, this new moderate regime, this regime that doesn't talk like insane psychopaths like the Ayatollahs talk, and the world wants them to be a success story and to not have to relive the last 46 years of this nightmare called the Iranian revolutionary regime, the Islamic Republic of Iran, what if it then says, I'm going for a nuke? And then the Israelis are back at square one, but without even the ability to explain to the world. All of these possibilities all exist, and they're all on the table, and we don't know how any of these end up. You have to take out the missile system, as much of it as you can get. You have to take out the nuclear capabilities, as much of it as you can get. If it's not all or nothing, it's how do you get to enough to achieve a future safety for as long as possible? And if that drives a regime change that has a different kind of regime with different priorities, that's the best case scenario. If that drives this regime, desperate to survive, to a negotiating table in which they give up their infrastructure, another one of the best case scenarios. I'm sorry to the Iranian people that'll keep having to live with this garbage. I mean, we've seen just over the last year, just mass protests by truck drivers and bakers and, small shop owners and huge protests and nurses all over Iran because they are a society that has one of the biggest oil deposits in the world that just went through a bad winter without gas because the regime has mismanaged this economy so horribly. I apologize to the Iranian people if the regime survives this by giving up its nuclear program, but my people will live safer for the next generation. I don't think the Israelis have the entire war scripted out. I think the Israelis have many, many possible endings that are good, some possible endings that are much less good. Obviously, contingency plans in case it all goes belly up, which you have to have. You have to assume the enemy is more competent, and then you generally do better in the war, even if it turns out the enemy is incompetent. That's where I think things stand.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I wanted to go with a question to you, which is just about the regime. It is incredible to me, and I know you've thought a great deal about this as well. It is incredible to me how October 7th set in train a series of events that could not have been more devastating to Iran's allies and to itself. This never would have happened. Hamas would not have been destroyed. Hezbollah would not have been destroyed. Assad might not have fallen. Israel may not have attacked Iran had October 7th never happened. It is just incredible. But what I ask myself looking at the region is, okay, a lot of the good stuff that Iran had is gone. The Assad regime. And the Assad regime, even more importantly than the regime itself, is the geography, right? That it just provided such a great avenue for the Iranians to get ultimately to Israel, to Lebanon and to Israel. That's gone.
And now the government is allowing Israel to use its airspace. They were using it anyway, but they've officially said that Israel...
they have not officially said that. That's a lot of our friends propagandizing on Twitter.
Okay.
They have apparently tacitly accepted what they had no choice but to accept.
Got it.
And I think Ahmed Ashara is a smart politician. But it is also remarkable to note how the Arabs have been, this is an illegal war. This is a shame. Israel should definitely stop. Which has basically been the tone. Even, I would say, I saw a joint statement from Moscow and from Ankara, and it was very similar. Nobody's going to miss the Iranians. The question is, if the regime is allowed to survive, do they ultimately have the regional infrastructure to reconstitute what they had? And that, to me, is the $64,000 question, and I don't know the answer to it. What do you think?
If they survive, I think it's simple. If they survive without the infrastructure for the nuclear program, that has to be rebuilt, and that's a 10-year arc, assuming the Mossad doesn't blow it up again. They're not that competent. And everything they've done, all the billions they've spent, all the sacrifices that has meant for Iranians, for ordinary Iranians, that was the investment in Hezbollah and the investment in the Houthis and the investment in the regime, in the militias in Iraq and Syria and in the Assad regime, all of that was for nothing. It was all for nothing because it was incompetently done. And they will continue to be that incompetent, and they'll be even less competent. And so, no, I think it's over. And I think it's over because the Israelis aren't going to stop now. In other words, yes, this war could also go go badly for the Israelis and we could leave the infrastructure in place and the Americans could turn their backs on us and we could actually have to deal with this again and again and again, and we could end up just having a bunch of wars with Iran over the next 3 years. All those kinds of possibilities are ahead of us. I don't know any serious Israeli official who thinks that, we've got this all figured out. We don't have this all figured out. This is war. And war is as they say in first day of officer school, war is the realm of the unknown. You lay your best laid plans, you go to meet the enemy, you hope you've done a good job, and from there on, you pretty much just have to wing it. I'll say one thing though. On October 8th, I did a podcast interview with an American podcast, Call Me Back. And one of my arguments
where we discovered you
over that whole week.
That's our pal Dan.
It's a good podcast.
Love
and
it.
Has done a great service for certainly for the Jews and I think also for the West. One of the points that I was trying to drive home to everyone everywhere, because it was everything you heard from every Israeli you knew, was that we woke up and we understood. And we understood the whole tentacle and this, the head of the snake and what Iran had done and what Hezbollah meant. Nothing would stay intact that had tried to destroy us. And no monsters would ever be allowed to be built on our borders again. And if you knew what we knew about ourselves, you would have known that there would be Israeli planes flying over Tehran right now. And that was something that we said at the first moment and the first day. And if you knew Hebrew and you talked to Israelis, you would have heard it. And everything else has been background noise. Gaza was a particular kind of war where you have to hunt through cities and through thousands of tunnel entrances into 500 kilometers of tunnels, an enemy that not hid under civilians as human shield, but whose fundamental strategy was the destruction of Gaza itself. You can argue the Israelis were terrible. You can argue the Israelis did the best they could. I'm not getting into that debate. I'm just saying Gaza was a war in which there was no other power other than Hamas that could step in. Once you weakened Hamas, there was no way to weaken Hamas because of its particular strategy of tunnels. But in every other arena, the enemy was fundamentally different. And so Israel, when it went into Lebanon to go after Hezbollah, managed to keep a perfect separation between Lebanon and Hezbollah in its own war fighting, to the point where everywhere the Israeli military advanced in South Lebanon as it moved in on those villages with those rocket arsenals, the Lebanese army an hour earlier left. And it ceded ground at every turn with the perfect absolute knowledge that every Lebanese person, whether they like it or not, want to admit it or not, knows, and most admit it openly, the Israelis were absolutely fighting a war against Hezbollah, not against Lebanon. That exact same story we're seeing today in Tehran. Now, ordinary residents of Tehran don't know if they're living next to a military target, and they're terrified, many of them. And we're seeing the traffic jams of people trying to flee Iran, that's trying to flee the city, try to flee Tehran. But there is also an awareness and a clarity that we're going after this regime, and we're not going after the people. And our best case scenario is that out of this war is born the Iran that should have been born in the original revolution in 1979. People don't remember, but that revolution wasn't just Islamists led by Khomeini and his clerics and his mosque networks. The liberals were part of that revolution. The Marxists were part of that revolution. The feminists, women marching for women's rights, were part of that revolution. 9 million people marched in the streets, 10% of the Iranian population in December of 1978. That was the moment where everybody understood that the Shah was no longer going to be able to survive with his repressive regime. And Khomeini broke that alliance as soon as he took power in February, and over the next 8 years killed thousands of dissidents, crushed student organizations. At the very initial moments after the Shah, there was a liberal nationalist government, the Iranian Freedom Movement, I think it was called. And then the Islamists turned on all the other allies who had helped bring them to power and defeat the Shah, and crushed Iran and sent it into this dark age. The ideal situation for Israel, the ideal result for Israel, is a reclamation of the original revolution, of broad-based, including led by Democrats and liberals, that brings Iran back into the light. So this is not a war on Iran, and has never been a war on Iran. It is a war to remove the monsters who have come for us. And I don't know how to put this politely, so I'll just say it very bluntly. We aren't going to stop. Most Israelis have lost faith in the government's ability to deliver a proper ending in Gaza, a defeat of Hamas, and a rebuilding of Gaza. And so there's a majority now in polling that say you got to end the war in Gaza. And it has to do with hostages, and it has to do with faith in Netanyahu personally and in the government generally. And it's very complex. Israeli public opinion is not simple. The same people that say, 70% of them in one poll, I think a month ago, we have to end the Gaza war, 70% and more, in fact, say we have to take the fight to Iran. So this has all been one war, and we woke up and we knew where this was going to go from the very beginning. And if they understood us better, if they were were a more competent regime that grasped who we are and what we're capable of, and that we're not just a carbon copy of their incompetence and brutality and oppression, but in fact a people that knows what's at stake, then they would have known how this is going to end, and they would know now that we're not going to stop until we're safe.
I don't even want to ask a question, but as you went through the litany of Iran's options and how it will be able to reconstitute itself, I did think to myself that this may not have been possible without the death of Qasem Soleimani. He, I think, in retrospect, even more than at the time, was such a critical linchpin for Iranian plans abroad. So strategic, so on his game, and they have not been able to replace him. When I thought about what you said, which is how Iran reconstitutes itself, right, as the power that it was on October 6, 2023, absent that man, it's going to be very, very hard.
I completely agree with you. That was his reputation, and there were people pushing him, very, very important factions in the regime, pushing him to be the next supreme leader because of the sense that he was the kind of brain that could put it all together. And so had we faced this exact same war, this exact same 20 months with him in charge, it could have gone a lot worse for us. I suspect that also would have made him the number one target for assassination at the beginning of the escalation. In other words, that would also have been something the Israelis would have pursued. But I want to say something larger, because if you step back to the larger picture, this is the man who really built out the proxies into what they became, into the monsters that Hezbollah became. And that tells me that actually, yes, he was by far more competent than Kani, who replaced him, and then a lot of the other. The most adorable thing was watching an interview with the head of the IRGC Navy, the only general not yet taken out, I think, and the only general nobody cares about. He's not. There's no naval front with Israel, and he's sitting there.
Have you seen that? Haviv, have you seen that excellent meme? Imagine being the only guy in the Iranian military leadership Israel doesn't care enough about to take out.
And he's interviewed, and he's blustering, and he's explaining that they're amazing, and they're, oh, don't worry, it's coming, our response is coming. And he's the only guy who doesn't have to worry because he doesn't control anything Israel's worried about. But nevertheless, Soleimani, even if he would have been tactically very smart, and he knew how to navigate, the complexities of Syria and Iran and Lebanon, and he knew how to supply the Houthis with ballistic missiles that they don't know how to make and barely know how to launch, even if that is true of him, and his loss was a real strategic setback, he nevertheless was the man who built the great strategy that just came crashing down. In other words, at a grand strategic level, it's one thing to be the kind of builder of armies that he was, that really you got to give him credit for. He built something. And at the same time, it was all a mistake. Hamas, when it launched October 7, genuinely believed that the proxy system was some kind of military alliance that was going to come to its rescue. And we have the letters of Sinwar. We know that he's deeply frustrated when Hezbollah doesn't and Iran doesn't now put everything at stake for Hamas. Iran, when it came to Hamas and said and upgraded Hamas and gave Hamas money and gave Hamas training and trained the Nukhba force that carried out October 7 on a model that had actually been developed for a Hezbollah attack of the same type. When Iran was doing that, it thought that Hamas understood that it was part of the proxy system. The proxy system's purpose is not to have Hamas launch a war Iran is dragged into. It was for Hamas to take the blows Iran doesn't have to take in the long arc, in the grand strategic arc. So this was a proxy system built badly, and not in a way that it ended up being a proxy system that bled Iran instead of bleeding Israel. And so I would submit that yes, absolutely, it would have been a harder fight if Soleimani was in charge, but also Soleimani walked the Iranian regime into this corner.
The question, if Soleimani had survived, would October 7th have happened? Would he have been smart enough, if he was such a strategic genius, to foresee that this would put everything that they had built at risk?
I have to say, Ismail Haniyeh himself was surprised by October 7th. Yeah. Sinwar had so compartmentalized Hamas because he was so afraid of Israeli intelligence. And for the next 20 months, we learned why he was so afraid of Israeli intelligence, that Hamas's own leadership didn't know October 7 was coming. So I don't know if Soleimani would have been able to, if he was in charge, it would have been better than what happened, but I don't know. I don't think Iran could have avoided this outcome. And I think that if it's smart, it'll understand that the Israelis' strength is real and deep and fundamental and institutional. And it's not going to suddenly defeat us with some kind of clever trick. It needs to take the loss, and it needs to lose the nuclear program.
So let me close with taking us back to the tactical level, because we've gone very high strategic. So you pointed out at the start about how, Iran had anywhere between 1,000 and 3,000 ballistic missiles. They lost 20% of that, let's say, in the first Israeli strikes before this war. Now Israel has been taking out their launchers, and they've fired a bunch of them. They have to fire, I think the number is at least 50 missiles in order to have a chance of defeating the Iron Dome and the defenses. So they have to fire large numbers of missiles in order to get one through. Is there a point in the near future where they just completely run out and the barrage stops? Are they going to run out of weapons? And How does that affect how this plays out in the coming days and weeks?
I know that the Israelis assume not. Now, that could be an abundance of caution. You don't assume the best case scenario, right? In a war, you assume the worst case scenario and prepare for it, and then everything goes a little bit better. But the Israelis assume that right up to the end, the Iranians are going to be able to keep doing this. There's a whole new system of warning the Israeli public in place that we haven't had, I don't know, a year and a half ago that I remember. They certainly worked very differently. It's much more accurate. It turns out that a couple of days ago, there's preliminary reports. They haven't really dug down, and I haven't seen the final word, but we've faced a 7-fold uptick in cyber attacks that are apparently sourced in Iran, and they've targeted specifically the siren warning systems so that civilians are not protected when the missiles fall to kill more civilians. It is deeply embarrassing to the Iranians that they've been unable, with these unbelievably expensive strategic weapons that they can't replace easily, to actually hurt many civilians. That is, if you're the Iranian public watching this, the whole thing is kind of a pathetic show of weakness rather than a show of force. And so they want to make it a show of force and sort of restore their ability to scare everybody. The Israelis assume that Iran needs to have the missiles continue forever and ever, right up until the very bitter end. Will there come a point where the last launcher is gone? Hopefully soon. The IDF announced that it has taken out a quarter, maybe the third. This morning it announced that after the massive missile hunt of the night by the Air Force, they have total control of the airspace, and they're going to keep hunting those launchers. The fact that they put out a percentage number of the launchers that they know they've taken out, I think is a message to the Iranians. We know how many you have. We know where they are. We are going to get to them eventually, and so good luck. Do your best. Enjoy this moment. It's going to get more pathetic from here on out. I think that's the Israeli military's message to the Iranian regime. I assume they can continue launching for quite a while.
I think that's right. But I have to say, somebody has said recently, this redefines shock and awe. It really does. It is a textbook case of, as you described it, a home run. I hope it stays that way. But most of all, I hope you stay safe. Thank you. Not just you, but everybody. Thank you for taking the time to be with us again. And I'm willing to bet we'll be back to you, asking you to come back on and talk about what's going on, because I love listening to your insights. Thank you, Haviv.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Mark. Have a good one.
Take care. All right, Danny. So at the start of this, we talked about the possibility of the U.S. intervening. Here's the other option that we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of talk by the Trump administration of maybe Iran will still come to the table seriously and allow us to go in and destroy all this. It's interesting. Somebody made a brilliant point on Dan Senor's podcast this morning that Trump is essentially using the Iranian proxy technique against them. He's saying, we have nothing to do with this. This is not us. This is Israel. In this case, Israel being our proxy. Do you see any possibility that the Iranian regime, after a few days from now, after it's received more pummeling, after it runs low on its ballistic missile capabilities and essentially is just lying there getting pummeled on the ground, that maybe they cry uncle? Or is this going to have to be militarily taken care of?
I think they're already militarily crying uncle. They are already trying to get out from under this. They are already trying to get their friends in the United States and in the region to get the Israelis to stop. The problem is the Iranians will promise anything right now. They will promise to end their nuclear weapons program. They will promise full verifiability. They will promise the IAEA that they will ratify everything they haven't ratified before. The problem is they won't do it. The Iranians are liars. Fool me once? We're not in fool me once, fool me twice. We are in fool me 25 times, fool me 100 times. The Iranians have been covertly building this program for decades. They are never going to stop. And by the way, what is the lesson if they survive right now? What is the lesson to them? That they must get nuclear weapons.
Yes, 100%. But, there is a verifiable way to do it. I mean, we did it in Libya. You allow the U.S. to come in and you open the gates and you allow us to go in and blow everything up or cart it out and take it out. And you allow us to do that at all of your sites.
That won't happen.
Yeah, but that's the only alternative, in my view. I don't see that there's an acceptable alternative. And by the way, that's what Trump has said. You either let us come in and blow it up that way, or we blow it up the other way. And you were talking earlier about Steve Witkoff. I've never seen any weakness on the part of Donald Trump when he talks about these things. His team, something different. But when Witkoff came in and put some offer on the table saying that they could continue enriching, he put on Truth Social, that moment, no enrichment, period, full stop, in all caps letters. So I've never seen any vacillation on the part of Trump about the ultimate objective here, and I don't expect that there will be.
From your mouth to his ears. is all I can say. Hey, folks, let us know what you think. Thanks for being with us on this different day, and we'll try to keep up with all of this breaking news.
See you next time.
Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.